All right, settle in, dim the lights, prepare yourself for a journey back to an era where the concept of love at first sight usually ended with both parties succumbing to the plague. We're diving deep into the exquisitely unpleasant world of the medieval matchmaker, a profession so deeply, soul-crushingly awful, it makes your current job look like a paid vacation to a spa staffed by cherubic, sentient cloud formations. Imagine, if you will, a job where your success, your very livelihood, hinged not on fostering joyous unions, but on orchestrating the misery of two unsuspecting souls. And your failure? Well, let's just say probable doom was often the best case scenario. Perhaps a slow, agonizing public shaming, a swift, sharp meeting with a headsman, or simply being left to starve in a ditch you yourself dug. That's the kind of career path we're talking about today. Now, I know what you're thinking. Matchmaking, that's all twinkling eyes and stolen glances, right? A quaint village elder with a twinkle in her eye, stirring a love potion over a gentle fire, humming a little tune about true love's kiss. Maybe a mischievous cherub with a tiny bow and arrow fluttering around, ensuring happily ever afters? Yeah, absolutely not. Scrap that entire saccharine, Hallmark card-fueled fantasy from your brain right now. Because in the gritty, disease-ridden reality of the medieval period, matchmaking was less about Cupid and more about contracts. Less about hearts fluttering and more about land deeds fluttering. There were no rosy-cheeked grandmothers trying to find your soulmate. There were only shrewd, often desperate individuals whose entire existence was a brutal game of human chess, where the pawns were sentient beings and the endgame was always power, property, or progeny. No love potions, unless you count a particularly potent ale designed to lower inhibitions and standards. No magic spells, unless you count the sheer, terrifying magic of a legally binding document trapping two strangers together until death, or a well-placed papal annulment, usually for exorbitant fees, did them part. This wasn't a romance novel. It was a particularly grim spreadsheet, updated by candlelight, usually in a hovel filled with the stench of unwashed humanity and existential dread. The core argument, the deliciously dark premise of our little historical dive today, is this. Being a medieval matchmaker was not just a job. It was a soul-crushing, high-stakes gamble with human lives, riddled with danger and almost utterly thankless. You were the medieval equivalent of a real estate agent, a commodities broker, and a therapist, all rolled into one, except your commodities could complain, your therapy sessions involved avoiding public humiliation, and your real estate deals often involved marrying someone's syphilitic uncle to a 16-year-old girl. It was a profession that tested the limits of human patience, ethics, and basic hygiene. You were constantly navigating a minefield of feuding families, hidden ailments, dodgy dowries, and the ever-present threat of your carefully constructed deal collapsing in a spectacular, reputation-shredding blaze of glory. Imagine pouring your heart and soul into a project, only for it to fall apart because the groom decided he'd rather become a monk, or, more likely, discovered his bride was secretly missing 3 fingers. Yeah, that kind of fun. Now, to properly appreciate the exquisite suckiness of this particular profession, we first need to set the stage. Picture it. The year is, let's say 1285. The air hangs heavy with the acrid tang of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the distant, ever-present scent of human waste. Your local river is less a flowing waterway and more a slow-moving, disease-laden slurry. Life expectancy? If you made it past 30, you were practically a sagely elder. If you saw 40, you were a verifiable wizard. Infant mortality was less a statistic and more a daily reality. The world was a relentless, brutal place where starvation was a constant companion, disease stalked every shadow, and political stability was about as reliable as a flat-pack wardrobe from the local carpenter. The concept of individual happiness was a quaint, practically heretical notion. Survival was the prime directive, securing land was paramount, and producing heirs, preferably male ones, was the ultimate goal. In this bleak, unforgiving landscape, the matchmaker wasn't some romantic figure. They were a grim necessity, an essential cog in the creaking, groaning machinery of medieval existence, facilitating deals that kept the fragile social order from utterly collapsing. Their services weren't desired for joy, but for grim, practical survival. And speaking of grim, practical survival, let's talk about the actual purpose of this video. We promised boring history for sleep, didn't we? A soothing drone of historical minutiae designed to lull your tired mind into a peaceful, historically accurate slumber. Well, consider this your warning. We're going to try our very best to bore you into oblivion, but the content itself might be just a tad bit more unsettling than your typical bedtime story about sheep counting. Think of it as a dark, twisted lullaby. A lullaby about the casual cruelty of arranged marriages, the relentless pursuit of power, and the sheer, unending misery of a job that traded in human beings as commodities. If you do manage to drift off, please, for the love of all that is holy, don't dream of medieval matchmakers. Don't dream of the smells, the desperation, the frantic attempts to hide a hunchback or subtly inquire about a family's rumored madness. Just sleep, if you can. Because while your modern problems might feel insurmountable, at least you don't have to convince a family that their daughter's chronic weeping is merely poetic sensitivity. So, what was a medieval matchmaker, truly? Let's strip away any lingering illusions of romantic comedy and confront the stark, uncomfortable truth. A matchmaker in the Middle Ages was not a purveyor of true love. They were, quite simply, a broker of people, land, and alliances. They were a flesh and blood LinkedIn algorithm, a human dating app powered by greed, desperation, and an almost pathological disregard for emotional compatibility. You, as the matchmaker, were the conduit through which vast sums of wealth, political power, and even the future of entire lineages flowed. You weren't pairing hearts, you were merging balance sheets. You were connecting powerful families not by their shared appreciation for a good sunset, but by their mutual need for more acreage, a strategic fort, or simply more healthy, legitimate bodies to carry on a name. It was the original synergy, long before corporate jargon ruined the word, but instead of merging departments, you were merging dynasties, often with all the warmth and personal touch of a hostile takeover bid. Why did such a grim profession even exist? Well, in an era before effective birth control, state-sponsored welfare, or even basic public sanitation, population control, resource management, and social stability were less about policy and more about survival. Matchmakers served a fundamental societal need. They were the grease in the gears of a brutally hierarchical system. They consolidated power by joining noble houses, preventing feuds by turning potential enemies into in-laws, And, most critically, securing heirs to continue family lines and prevent the catastrophic dissolution of estates. Without a matchmaker, families might flounder, fall into ruin, or descend into generations-long blood feuds over a disputed pigsty. You were a necessary evil, a human firewall against total societal collapse, ensuring that the relentless march of medieval life continued, one awkward, forced union at a time. It bypassed the messiness, the sheer inefficiency of actual human emotion. And that, my dear insomniac-to-be, brings us to the utterly delightful absence of love in this whole equation. Let's be unequivocally clear. Love was not merely an irrelevant factor in medieval matchmaking. It was often a detrimental one. Sentimentality was for troubadours, and troubadours usually died young, often from hypothermia or a particularly aggressive strain of dysentery, not from a broken heart. You weren't looking for a spark. You were looking for a dowry. You weren't assessing emotional depth. You were assessing land deeds and the lack of visible pox scars. The entire exercise was a business transaction, pure and simple, and any genuine affection that miraculously blossomed between the unfortunate parties was merely a bonus, a happy accident, like finding an extra gruel ration after a particularly lean harvest. To even suggest that two people should choose their own spouse based on fleeting emotions was practically an insult to the entire social fabric, an affront to the carefully constructed power dynamics that kept the world from dissolving into absolute chaos. Love, after all, couldn't buy you a castle, couldn't raise an army, and certainly couldn't produce a legitimate male heir. So, why bother? Even the all-encompassing, ever-present church, with its iron grip on medieval morality, largely supported this pragmatic approach to marriage. While it drew lines, consanguinity, meaning marrying too close a relative was a big no-no, requiring expensive papal dispensations if you simply had to marry your first cousin, it otherwise threw its considerable weight behind arranged marriages. Why? Because arranged marriages were stable. They prevented messy emotional entanglements, ensured the orderly transfer of property, and maintained the social hierarchy, which, conveniently for the church, often meant more tithes and less social unrest. It wasn't about two souls uniting before God. It was about two families uniting their assets, their influence, and their lineage, with God as a solemn, slightly disapproving witness. The church condemned lust, yet tacitly approved of a system that often forced individuals into emotionally bereft unions, all for the sake of stability. A classic medieval paradox, wouldn't you say? Almost as charming as a peasant's freshly laundered tunic, which is to say, not charming at all. Now, imagine stepping into your office, which, in your case, is probably a drafty corner of a smoky tavern, or perhaps a particularly sturdy tree stump in the village square, and preparing to meet your esteemed clientele. What a glorious cross-section of humanity you'd encounter! First up, you have the desperate nobles. These weren't your glittering chivalrous knights from the storybooks. Oh no. These were the land-poor lords, the heirless counts, the venerable families clinging to the brink of ruin by their fingernails. Their demands? Usually exorbitant. They wanted a princess with a dowry that could bail out a small kingdom, a sturdy, son-producing bride, or a husband with an army and a castle yesterday. Their offerings? Often laughably paltry. A few acres of marshland, a minor title that no one respected, or a daughter with a legendary cough. They'd sit across from you, their eyes glittering with a mixture of pride and utter desperation, trying to convince you that their dilapidated manor house was merely rustic, and their lineage, despite being riddled with generations of first-cousin marriages, was unblemished. You, meanwhile, would be mentally tallying how many bushels of grain it would take to feed their remaining retinue for a month, knowing full well you were probably dealing with a pyramid scheme of ancestral debt. Then there were the ambitious newcomers, a refreshing, if equally irritating, breed. These were the merchants, often dripping with the scent of their latest successful wool shipment, seeking to parlay their newfound wealth into something a little more substantial than just, well, money. They wanted titles. They craved social climbing. They had the coin, all right, probably enough to buy and sell a few impoverished dukes, but they lacked the essential ingredient, bloodline. They didn't have a great-great-grandfather who fought alongside William the Conqueror. Their lineage probably traced back to a particularly successful pig farmer. They'd eye you with a mixture of deference and barely concealed disdain, knowing you held the key to their ascension, yet secretly believing their gold could solve anything. You'd have to explain, painstakingly, that marrying a noble was like trying to patch a silk garment with a burlap sack. It often looked cheap and wore out quickly unless you possessed truly exceptional tailoring skills, or in this case, a truly exceptional matchmaker. And even then, the old guard would still sniff at them, muttering about new money behind their backs, which was, in medieval terms, akin to being called a goblin in a powdered wig. Next, the widows and widowers. Ah, the glorious encore performances of medieval matrimony. These individuals usually weren't seeking passionate love. They were seeking security, often children for inheritance purposes, especially the men, or sometimes just a warm body to share the eternal draft of a medieval castle. But they came with baggage. Oh, the baggage. Actual children, often sticky, loud, and inconveniently attached to their departed parent. Debts, usually gargantuan and labyrinthine, inherited from the deceased spouse like a particularly virulent social disease. And reputations, sometimes sterling, sometimes dubious. Had the previous spouse died naturally, or was there a whisper of an unfortunate mushroom selection? Was the widow notoriously stubborn, or did the widower have a legendary temper that could curdle milk at 20 paces? Your job was to unearth these delightful details, often by bribing servants with a particularly shiny button, and then present them in a way that didn't immediately send your next client fleeing into the night. And finally, the absolute crème de la crème of your professional agony, the problem children. These were the sickly, the notoriously difficult, the physically deformed, the ones no one else, not even their own families, really wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole. These were your true challenges, your Everest, your final boss level. You'd get a parchment from a desperate baron. My son, Harold, is rather quiet and prone to staring at walls for hours. Also, he has a noticeable twitch and a peculiar fondness for raw eels. Can you find him a wife? Congratulations, you get to marry the Duke's cousin, who communicates exclusively through grunts and biting, to a landless knight whose only discernible skill is an uncanny ability to lose all his teeth before the age of 30. These were the prospects that tested your creativity, your ethical boundaries, and your very sanity. You'd stare at these unblinking, often drooling individuals and wonder, what dark magic can I conjure to make this palatable to anyone with a pulse? It was a masterclass in spin doctoring, long before spin doctors even had a concept of public relations, more like public despair. So you've got your motley crew of clients. Now comes the exciting part, assessing your inventory. And by inventory, I mean the living, breathing human beings you were tasked with selling. And let me tell you, the inventory often left much to be desired. First, the physical attributes. Forget your modern ideals of symmetrical faces, toned physiques, and gleaming smiles. In the medieval period, beauty standards were a loosely defined concept, often boiling down to, is she alive, and does she look like she might survive childbirth? Or, for men, can he swing a sword without immediately collapsing? The reality was disease, everywhere. Smallpox scars were less a flaw and more a badge of honor, a sign you'd survived something. Poor hygiene was the default. Baths were rare and often considered medically unsound. Teeth were a luxury, usually falling out by your 20s, leaving you with a charming, toothless grin that probably smelled faintly of fermented cabbage. Hard labor, malnutrition, and a complete lack of preventative medicine meant that most people, regardless of their station, looked like they'd been put through a medieval meat grinder and then told to smile. You weren't looking for a supermodel. You were looking for someone who could plausibly stand upright without assistance and whose skin wasn't actively flaking off. Forget perfect teeth, we're talking about any teeth. But by far, the most crucial asset in your inventory was lineage and pedigree. This was the gold standard, the medieval credit score, the thing that separated the vaguely important from the utterly insignificant. You, the matchmaker, had to be a walking, talking genealogical database. Tracing family trees wasn't a hobby, it was a life or death skill. Was the prospective bride's maternal grandmother a known witch? Did the groom's paternal line have a suspicious number of members who died suddenly and violently in their sleep? Legitimate versus illegitimate children was a constant, thorny issue, as a well-placed bastard could either be a useful pawn or a catastrophic scandal, depending on who was asking. And notorious ancestors, both good and bad, were a double-edged sword. Sure, having a grandfather who fought with Charlemagne looked good on paper, but if his son was universally known as Bertram the bovine butcher for his peculiar habit of dismembering livestock with his bare hands, well, that's a different conversation entirely. You had to know it all. Sift through generations of gossip, rumor, and half-truths, all to present a lineage that was just clean enough to pass muster. Of course, what truly drove the deals, what really made the medieval world spin, were lands and titles. These were the tangible assets, the things that truly mattered when two families were playing their generational game of financial chicken. Acreage. How much, where was it, and how productive was it? Castles. Was it a formidable fortress or a crumbling pile of stones that would bankrupt its new owner just to repair the privy? Manors. Were they rich in tenants, or had they been plundered by the last passing army? And the endless disputes over their value, their boundaries, their historical claims. You'd spend hours, days, weeks poring over dusty parchments, listening to lawyers drone on about feudal obligations, trying to ascertain if that fertile valley was actually a mosquito-infested swamp, or if that strategic overlook was just a particularly bumpy hill. Your ability to accurately assess and articulate the value of these assets, often inflated or subtly misrepresented by their current owners, was paramount. This was where the real money and the real power lay. And then, dear friends, we arrive at the undesirables. These were the raw materials that truly tested your mettle. Unflattering physical descriptions, often understated in the official family pronouncements. A sturdy build might mean morbidly obese. A thoughtful disposition could translate to catatonic. Known diseases, leprosy wasn't exactly a selling point, but you might have to discreetly gloss over a few questionable skin lesions. Plague scars, again, proof of survival, but perhaps not ideal for a first impression. The pox, the infamous French disease, with its delightful facial disfigurations, was a common hurdle. Rumored madness. Was Aunt Mildred's penchant for conversing with imaginary squirrels merely eccentric, or was it a hereditary condition waiting to blossom in her unsuspecting offspring? Secret deformities. A club foot hidden beneath voluminous robes, a withered arm carefully concealed, a missing eye perpetually gazing into the middle distance. These were your raw materials, the lumps of clay you had to mold into something vaguely appealing, something that wouldn't send the prospective family screaming into the night. Forget perfect teeth, we're talking about any teeth, preferably still attached to the skull. Your job was less about finding a perfect fit and more about finding a tolerable mismatch, a compromise so abysmal it was almost poetic. Let's talk stakes, shall we? Because in the grand, miserable theater of medieval matchmaking, the stakes weren't just high, they were stratospheric. They dwarfed your rickety wooden tower, overshadowed your pitiful patch of turnips, and threatened to consume your entire miserable existence. A marriage wasn't just a quaint little ceremony. It was a geopolitical earthquake, a financial tsunami, and a generational gamble, all rolled into one. First up, political alliances. You, the matchmaker, were often unknowingly playing geopolitical chess, where people were literal pawns. A single marriage could prevent a bloody, protracted war that would decimate entire regions and plunge thousands into suffering. It could forge new alliances, turning bitter rivals into cautious, often resentful allies. It could solidify existing power structures, cementing a dynasty's hold on a territory for generations. Or, conversely, a poorly judged match, a slight, a broken engagement, could ignite conflicts that burned for decades, spilling untold blood and treasure. You weren't just introducing two families, you were potentially redrawing borders, shifting the balance of power, and dictating the future of nations. No pressure, just the collective fate of vast swaths of humanity resting on your ability to make Lord Cedric palatable to Lady Isolde, despite his persistent flatulence and her unfortunate tendency to scream whenever a cat entered the room. Then there was the little matter of economic stability. Forget your modern retirement plans or investment portfolios. In the Middle Ages, a good marriage was the retirement plan, the investment strategy, and the social safety net. Dowries, those hefty sums or parcels of land a bride brought to a marriage, could secure a family's financial future for generations. Land merges, joint ventures in milling or farming, pooling resources to build a better fortress, these were the bedrock of medieval prosperity. A savvy match could elevate a struggling family to newfound wealth and influence. A bad match, however, could be catastrophic. It could lead to financial ruin, massive debts, the loss of ancestral lands, and the complete collapse of a family's standing. You, as the matchmaker, were essentially a medieval financial advisor, except instead of recommending diversified portfolios, you are recommending that a perfectly healthy young woman marry a man twice her age with a known gambling addiction, all to save her family from destitution. And if that match went sideways, if the promised dowry never materialized, or the land turned out to be cursed, it wasn't just a bad investment. It was the utter annihilation of a family's prospects. But perhaps the most profound stake, the existential dread that haunted every noble house, was lineage and heirs. In a world where your entire identity, your wealth, and your power were tied to your bloodline, the failure to produce an heir, particularly a male one, was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. It meant the end of your name, the dissolution of your lands, the scattering of your influence. The pressure to produce sons was immense, a suffocating blanket of expectation that settled upon every newlywed couple, and by extension, upon you, the matchmaker. You were facilitating the continuation of entire dynasties. You were trying to connect two people, ideally of childbearing age and capacity, who might, just might, produce a healthy, legitimate male heir. The desperate measures taken to secure a bloodline, from frantic prayers to questionable herbal remedies, from serial marriages to allegations of witchcraft, all pointed to this singular, overriding obsession. You were literally playing with the genetic lottery, trying to orchestrate an outcome that was, in the end, entirely up to the whims of biology and fate. And then there was your reputation, and by direct extension, your life. The success or failure of a match wasn't just a line item on your ledger. It was your standing in the community, your future income, and sometimes, quite literally, whether you lived to see another sunrise. A brilliant match, one that united two powerful families and produced a brood of healthy sons, could elevate you to the status of a revered, indispensable sage. It could mean patronage, protection, and a steady stream of lucrative clients. But one truly disastrous match, one where the dowry vanished, the groom turned out to be impotent, or the bride mysteriously expired 3 days after the wedding, could spell utter catastrophe for you. You were the easy scapegoat. Threats, curses, demands for compensation, even accusations of witchcraft were not uncommon. No pressure, just the future of two powerful families, their economic stability, their political standing, and the continuity of their bloodline, all resting on your ability to make Lord Cedric, who smells faintly of badger and has a worrying twitch in his left eye, palatable to Lady Eleanor, whose only discernible personality trait is her legendary ability to play the lute badly. Your life, your very existence, hinged on your ability to sell desperation as destiny. Before you even thought about bringing two unfortunates together, there was the glorious, ethically dubious, and absolutely essential phase of due diligence, or, as it was more commonly known to those involved, spying on your neighbors with extreme prejudice. This wasn't about a quick Google search. This was about deep cover, cloak and dagger intelligence gathering, usually involving copious amounts of bribery and whispered secrets. Your first and most valuable asset in this subterranean world was the gossip network. Forget social media. In the medieval period, the rumor mill was your high-speed internet. Servants, merchants, priests, wandering mendicants, local brewers, the village gossips, these were your unwitting informants. A well-placed coin, a free meal, or a promise of future favor could unlock a treasure trove of invaluable and often wildly embellished information. Was the prospective groom known for his gambling debts? Did the bride's mother have a suspiciously high turnover rate for personal attendance? You needed to know the whispers, the unspoken truths, the things that families tried desperately to hide. The power of whispers in medieval society was immense. A single, carefully spread rumor could unravel a perfectly good match, or, more importantly, expose a perfectly bad one that you might have otherwise overlooked. Then came the tedious, eye-straining work of sifting through family trees and records. This was where your inner archivist, your ancestral detective, truly shone. You'd scrutinize church records for baptismal dates, death notices, and, crucially, any inconveniently unrecorded births. Noble genealogies were pored over, looking for daps, for sudden disappearances, for suspiciously vague entries that might hide an embarrassing relative or a forgotten scandal. Land deeds, often centuries old, were examined for hidden flaws, forgotten debts, or, the ultimate horror, a contested claim that could invalidate an entire estate. And the greatest enemy of any matchmaker, the inconvenient bastard child. Was there a whispered tale of a forgotten liaison, a secret love child tucked away in a distant monastery, whose existence could complicate inheritance claims and throw the entire legitimacy of a noble line into question? You had to unearth these skeletons from their dusty, forgotten closets before they came rattling out at the most inopportune moment, like, say, mid-wedding feast. Of course, a parchment only tells you so much. You also needed to physically inspect your potential candidates, often covertly. This wasn't a job interview, it was a stakeout. You couldn't just rock up to a castle and demand to see the merchandise. So you resorted to subterfuge. Disguises were a matchmaker's best friend. Posing as a traveling merchant, a wandering minstrel, a humble pilgrim seeking alms. Anything to gain discreet access to a noble household. Anonymous visits to local markets or village fairs where the candidates might be present, allowing you to observe them from a distance. And bribing staff? Absolutely essential. A sympathetic chambermaid, a disgruntled stable boy, a particularly talkative cook, they could provide invaluable, unfiltered insights into the daily habits, temperaments, and physical realities of your potential match. Was the Lord as strong and virile as his family claimed? Or did he spend most of his days clutching his stomach and making frequent, desperate trips to the privy? You needed to know before committing to a deal that could cost you your reputation, or worse, your head. This, my friends, was the dark art of investigation, where you delved into the murky depths of human nature. Your job was to uncover not just physical ailments, but secret vices, political leanings that might clash catastrophically, and actual mental instabilities. Was that charming eccentricity, Lord Bartholomew's habit of talking to his pet rock, a benign quirk, or the early signs of full-blown, axe-wielding madness? You decide. Was the prospective bride's delicate constitution
actually a euphemism for consumption, or even worse, the French pox, discreetly hidden beneath layers of heavy fabric and even heavier perfume. You had to discern the truth from the elaborate web of deceit and denial spun by desperate families. You were a medieval detective, a historical psychologist, and a master of disguise, all rolled into one, tirelessly piecing together a horrifying puzzle, knowing that one missing piece could lead to your professional or even literal demise. It was less about matchmaking and more about unmasking, a relentless pursuit of inconvenient truths hidden beneath layers of medieval squalor and polite deception. All right, you've done your due diligence, unearthed enough secrets to fill a small, unholy library, and now it's time for the first impression. And let me be perfectly clear, this was not a date, not in any sense that a modern person would recognize. There was no casual flirtation, no awkward small talk over artisanal coffee, mostly because coffee wouldn't arrive for centuries and artisanal anything was a miracle. This was an inspection, a formal, often terrifying process of two families meeting, less like a casual get-together and more like a high-stakes corporate merger presentation, except everyone involved was probably armed and smelled faintly of goat. The atmosphere would be thick with tension, palpable enough to cut with a dull medieval knife. Every gesture, every word, every subtle sniff was scrutinized. The stakes were astronomical, and the pressure on everyone, especially the poor souls being paraded, was immense. Imagine your worst job interview, multiply it by the weight of generational expectations, then add the constant threat of a duel breaking out over a perceived slight, and you're halfway there. And speaking of parading, get ready for the grand performance, the parade of the prospective. The candidates, often bewildered and terrified, would be presented like livestock at a particularly brutal county fair. They'd be cleaned up, probably scrubbed raw, and dressed in their best, often ill-fitting clothes. The ladies might be laced into corsets so tight they could barely breathe, their hair elaborately braided and pinned to distract from any facial blemishes. The gentlemen might be stuffed into their father's old tunics, struggling to project an air of strength and competence despite a raging fear of public humiliation. They would stand, often stiff and silent, as their respective families extolled their virtues, exaggerated their accomplishments, and glossed over their obvious flaws. The room would be filled with awkward silences, punctuated by forced pleasantries, and the clinking of tankards as the elders pretended to engage in polite conversation while subtly assessing every inch of the merchandise. It was a spectacle of forced civility, a masterclass in putting on a brave, often clammy face. But the real joy, the peak of medieval awkwardness, came with the physical examination. Oh, yes. This wasn't just a casual glance. This was a grim reality, a fundamental part of the process where potential spouses were assessed for childbearing capacity, for hidden deformities that might compromise an heir, and for overall health. This wasn't just done by the other family, who would often send their most hawk-eyed matriarch to scrutinize every curve and limb. Oh no. Often, a physician would be brought in, a medieval medical professional who would probe, prod, and sometimes even perform a frankly invasive examination, all in the name of ensuring a viable union. Imagine having your entire physical being, your every blemish, every lump, every scar, meticulously cataloged and judged, not for your own health,
but for your potential as a brood rare or a stud. This wasn't about attraction, it was about utility. It was about making sure the goods were fit for purpose, that they didn't harbor any inconvenient diseases, and that they had the requisite number of limbs and orifices for, shall we say, reproductive efficiency. Charming, isn't it? And finally, the interview. Although, again, interview implies a two-way street, a conversation. This was less a dialogue and more an interrogation. Questions about dowry, about lands, about suitability, all directed at the family, often bypassing the individual entirely. The prospective bride might be asked to play a lute, badly, or to demonstrate her embroidery skills, while the actual negotiation about her future was conducted over her head. The prospective groom might be asked to recite his lineage or to describe his martial prowess, while the real discussion revolved around the productivity of his fields. It was an exercise in dehumanization, where the individual's feelings, thoughts, or desires were utterly irrelevant. The focus was entirely on their family's standing, their assets, their connections. You, as the matchmaker, would hover nearby, translating, mediating, and subtly manipulating the conversation, trying to steer it towards a successful conclusion, all while suppressing the urge to scream at the sheer, brutal absurdity of it all. It was a stark reminder that in the medieval world, you weren't marrying a person, you were marrying a portfolio. Welcome, dear friends, to the glittering, utterly brutal world of medieval finance, where your matchmaking skills truly came into their own. This wasn't about love, not even about mild affection. This was about the numbers game. This was about dowries, dower, and the exquisite art of financial blackmail. First, let's dissect the dowry. This wasn't just a gift. It was the bedrock of medieval marriage contracts, a sum of money, goods, or, most commonly, land that the bride's family provided to the groom upon marriage. It was immense. Its significance cannot be overstated. It was meant to support the wife and her children, to integrate her into her new family, and, crucially, to compensate the groom for taking her off her father's hands. It often never truly belonged to the wife herself, remaining under her husband's control or in trust for her future children. You, as the matchmaker, were the primary architect of this financial transfer, trying to squeeze every last copper coin or every last unproductive acre out of the bride's family, knowing full well that the groom's family would demand nothing less than a small kingdom's ransom. But wait, there's a counteroffer. We also have the dower and jointure. These were the husband's provisions for his wife, should she, God forbid, outlive him. The dower was usually a specified portion of the husband's land or income, set aside for his wife's support during her widowhood. Jointure was a more formalized version, often negotiated as part of the marriage contract itself, providing a specific property or income. This was the eternal struggle. The bride's family trying to secure the best possible dower for their daughter, ensuring she wouldn't be destitute if her husband kicked the bucket from a suspiciously timed stomach ailment, and the groom's family trying to keep their assets intact. You, the matchmaker, were caught in the crossfire, negotiating fiercely for both sides, trying to extract concessions without completely alienating either party. It was a high-wire act of financial diplomacy, performed over a pit of ancestral resentment and potential poverty. And this, my friends, is where the true gladiatorial spectacle began: haggling and negotiation. This wasn't a quick chat over a cup of tea.
This was a relentless, often multi-day, sometimes multi-week, process of intense negotiation over every single coin, every last acre, every minor privilege. The value of livestock, the fertility of fields, the strength of a castle wall, the number of tapestries, the quality of a fur cloak. Nothing was too small to be argued over, sometimes to the point of outright shouting matches that threatened to dissolve the entire fragile agreement. You, the matchmaker, were the ultimate deal broker, the mediator, the one who had to maintain a poker face while simultaneously convincing Lord Reginald that 5 sheep and a slightly used iron pot constituted a fair price for his daughter, who, let's be honest, had a rather unsettling habit of talking to unseen spirits. It was an exhausting, emotionally draining marathon of financial brinksmanship, often fueled by copious amounts of cheap wine and the simmering resentments of generations. And in this glorious symphony of financial manipulation, one instrument played a particularly prominent tune: exaggerating assets. Oh, the sheer, unadulterated beauty of medieval marketing. It was common practice to inflate land values beyond all recognition, to promise resources that were, shall we say, not quite there, and to generally bluff your way through the entire transaction. That vast, fertile meadow might, in reality, be a mosquito-infested swamp prone to seasonal flooding. That well-stocked granary might contain enough grain to feed a particularly hungry squirrel for a week. That strategic hunting ground might be home to 3 scrawny rabbits and a badger with a bad attitude. You were a master of linguistic gymnastics, a wordsmith of wishful thinking. Oh, that's not a swamp, my lord, that's a future aquaculture investment. Or, that's not a crumbling tower, good sir. That's a testament to its ancient origins, steeped in history. Your ability to spin straw into gold, or at least into something vaguely resembling a promising asset, was essential, because in the medieval numbers game, honesty was often a luxury few could afford, and fewer still were willing to entertain. All right, you've somehow navigated the initial introductions and the financial bloodbath. You're feeling a flicker of hope, a tiny ember of optimism that this deal might actually go through. Then come the minor complications. And by minor, of course, I mean deal breakers so catastrophic they could unravel entire kingdoms, hidden horrors that would make your stomach churn and your spirit wither. First up, the big one: impotence and infertility. In an heir-obsessed society, these were the ultimate deal breakers. A marriage without the promise of progeny was, to many, no marriage at all. And the insidious thing was, you often only discovered these issues after the marriage, sometimes long after. Imagine the chaos, the recriminations, the sheer unbridled fury when a noble family realizes their carefully acquired daughter or son is simply incapable of producing the much-needed heir. Accusations would fly, often directed squarely at you, the hapless matchmaker. Was this an intentional deception? Did you know Lord Cuthbert had the virility of a damp sponge? The ensuing chaos could involve annulment proceedings, public humiliation, and demands for the immediate return of dowries and compensation that would beggar a lesser man. Then there were the delightful panoply of diseases and deformities.
A hidden case of leprosy, meticulously concealed beneath layers of clothing and makeup, could erupt after the wedding, turning celebration into a nightmare. The French pox, syphilis, was a particularly nasty surprise, often leaving its victims disfigured, debilitated, and tragically infertile. Consumption, tuberculosis, was a slow, insidious killer, its victims wasting away while their families watched in despair. Or a clubfoot, disguised by a voluminous gown, a withered arm carefully kept out of sight, a squint that was dismissed as charming, a persistent cough chalked up to the dampness. The constant fear was of a surprise revelation, a sudden, undeniable manifestation of a pre-existing condition. The constant fear was of a surprise revelation, a sudden, undeniable manifestation of a pre-existing condition that would invalidate the entire premise of the marriage. You, the matchmaker, would be sweating profusely, perpetually terrified that your carefully constructed facade of health and vitality would crumble, revealing the sickly, struggling reality beneath. And let's not forget the ever-present shadow of consanguinity, marrying too close to a relative. The church had very strict, if sometimes confusing, rules on this. Marrying your second cousin was generally acceptable, but your first cousin? That required a papal dispensation, an expensive and often drawn-out process that could scuttle a deal entirely. More distant relatives? Sometimes it was allowed, sometimes it wasn't, depending on the current pope's mood and the size of your offering. But the implications were scandalous. Accusations of incest, of producing tainted offspring, could be devastating to a noble reputation. You had to navigate these intricate familial webs with the precision of a master cartographer, tracing connections back generations, trying to avoid any inconveniently close blood ties that would require a small fortune in religious paperwork, or worse, make the union utterly forbidden. It was a constant game of medieval 6 degrees of separation, where one wrong connection could land everyone in spiritual and often literal hot water. But perhaps the ultimate betrayal, the true nightmare scenario, involved secret vows and prior contracts. Imagine, after months of agonizing negotiation, after all the dowry haggling and inspection, you discover, usually through a whispered confession or a vengeful informant, that one of the parties is already secretly betrothed, or, even worse, has taken holy vows. They might have pledged themselves to another years ago, a secret betrothal in a forgotten village. Or perhaps the prospective bride, in a moment of youthful piety, had sworn to become a nun. These hidden commitments could invalidate the entire marriage contract, making it null and void and throwing your reputation into the deepest pit of medieval despair. The implications were catastrophic. Broken contracts, massive financial penalties, public scandal, and usually all blame funneled directly to you, the utterly blameless, in this instance, matchmaker. It was the ultimate gotcha moment, the unforeseen iceberg that could sink your meticulously built ship of marital despair. And finally, the insidious terror of mental peculiarities, when eccentric turned into undeniably insane. In an age with no understanding of mental health, a family might simply explain away a prospective bride's tendency to chew on her hair and bark at the moon as a vibrant artistic spirit, or a groom's sudden violent rages as passionate intensity. But for you, the matchmaker, these were terrifying red flags. Because if that vibrant artistic spirit blossomed into full-blown madness after the wedding, resulting in the bride setting fire to the tapestry and attempting to feed the Lord's favorite hunting dog to the pigeons, you, dear matchmaker, would be held personally responsible. The lack of understanding, the superstitious fear surrounding mental illness, meant that the solutions were brutal: imprisonment, chaining, or simply locking the individual in a remote tower. And you would be the one who had facilitated this nightmare, the one who had brought this peculiarity into a noble house, with all the accompanying recriminations, threats, and potential financial ruin. These weren't minor complications. They were ticking time bombs, each one ready to detonate and obliterate your career and possibly your life. So, you've survived the horrors of due diligence and the gauntlet of the first impression. You've even, by some miracle, convinced two sets of utterly disillusioned families that their offspring are, in fact, suitable for one another. A betrothal is declared. This isn't just a quaint little engagement announcement, mind you. In the medieval period, a betrothal was a serious, legally binding contract, often as serious as the marriage itself. It was usually a public affair, a formal agreement sealed with a handshake, a kiss, and sometimes even an exchange of rings or tokens, witnessed by family, friends, and often local clergy. This wasn't something you could just call off with a polite note and a returned ring. This was a commitment, a promise made before God and man, with significant legal and financial ramifications if broken. Think of it as signing a prenuptial agreement that you absolutely cannot back out of, short of an act of God or the Pope himself. But what happens when, inevitably, things do fall apart? Breaking the contract of a betrothal was not a trivial matter. It carried immense financial penalties. Dowries, or at least portions of them, might have already been transferred. Lands might have been mentally reallocated. The aggrieved family would demand significant compensation, often ruinous amounts, for the loss of face, the damage to their reputation, and the potential impact on their future marital prospects. Beyond the financial, there was the devastating loss of face for both families, a public humiliation that could haunt them for generations. And perhaps most dangerously, a broken betrothal carried the very real potential for feuds and violence. What began as a legal dispute could quickly escalate into blood vengeance, with knights riding out to reclaim honor and entire families locked in generations-long vendettas. You, as the matchmaker, would be caught directly in the crossfire, the convenient scapegoat upon whom all the blame and fury would descend. Because, make no mistake, when things went south, you were almost always blamed. Whether it was your fault or not, the matchmaker was the easiest target for the furious, financially ruined, and publicly humiliated families. You promised Lord Godfrey was fertile. You swore Lady Isabella had a sweet disposition, not a penchant for setting fire to the stable. Threats, curses, and demands for immediate, often astronomical compensation would be hurled your way. You might find your name dragged through the mud, your reputation in tatters, and your very livelihood destroyed. You might even face physical retribution, a beating, or worse, if the families involved were particularly powerful and vengeful. It was a terrifying reality, a constant reminder that your professional success came with the ever-present threat of becoming the villain in someone else's medieval tragedy. Were there outs? Sometimes, rarely.
You might, if you were exceptionally clever and had deeply entrenched legal knowledge, have cleverly worded a contract to include specific clauses that allowed for termination under certain, highly improbable circumstances. Perhaps a hidden clause that stated the betrothal would be null and void if one party spontaneously combusted, or if a papal dispensation could be secured. This was usually based on pre-existing impediments, like discovering the couple were unknowingly related within prohibited degrees, or one had secretly taken holy vows. But papal dispensations were expensive, time-consuming, and required a truly compelling, or well-funded, reason. They were a rare and costly escape hatch, not a convenient backdoor. For the most part, a betrothal was a binding agreement, and breaking it was like trying to put a genie back in its bottle, almost impossible, profoundly messy, and likely to leave a lingering, unpleasant smell. And the poor matchmaker? Left to pick up the pieces, often literally, as angry peasants might come for their deserved compensation. Congratulations, you glorious, conniving, morally ambiguous individual. Against all odds, you've actually made it to the wedding. This is it, your success story. But again, let's temper your expectations. A medieval wedding wasn't the joyous, Instagram-ready affair you might envision. Oh no. It was less about romance and more about public declarations, legalities, and the solemn transfer of property and persons. The ceremony itself might be held in a drafty church, or perhaps outdoors in front of a cheering or jeering crowd, presided over by a stern-faced priest who cared more about the sanctity of the vows than the happiness of the parties involved. There might be a procession, perhaps some rudimentary music, but the overriding atmosphere was one of solemnity, duty, and immense pressure. This was a contractual agreement, formalized before God, witnessed by the community, and designed to produce heirs and cement alliances. Any romantic flutterings were purely incidental, a happy bonus if they occurred, but certainly not the primary objective. But the real make-or-break moment, the absolute cornerstone of a medieval marriage, was the consummation. This wasn't a private, intimate moment between two smitten newlyweds. Oh dear, no. This was a critical, often shockingly public act. In many cases, especially among the nobility, the consummation of the marriage was witnessed, not in a truly explicit sense, but sometimes trusted family members or even a delegation of witnesses would be present in the bedchamber to ensure the act was at least attempted, and often to verify its successful completion the next morning. Imagine the pressure. Two strangers, forced into a bed with the weight of two families, two lineages, and two dowries riding on their ability to perform. The pressure on the newlywed couple was immense, terrifying, and deeply humiliating. And by extension, this pressure bore down on you, the matchmaker. If the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be grounds for annulment, unraveling all your hard work and plunging you back into the financial and reputational abyss. Your success literally hinged on these two awkward individuals getting it on. And then the feast. Ah, the medieval wedding feast. This was a major social event, a chance for families to display their wealth, their generosity, and their questionable culinary skills. It was a cacophony of loud revelry, copious amounts of alcohol, and an abundance of rich, often questionable food. But beneath the surface, it was ripe for disaster. Drunken arguments could erupt, old feuds rekindled, and brawls could break out over imagined slights or spilled wine. And crucially,
It was often during these boozy, unguarded moments that more secrets would inevitably come spilling out. A tipsy uncle might inadvertently reveal a long-held family shame. A disgruntled servant might whisper a forgotten bastard, or a jealous rival might plant a seed of doubt about the bride's virtue. Your job, matchmaker, wasn't over. You had to hover like a nervous hawk, eyes wide, ears perked, ready to intervene, to deflect, to smooth over any potential disaster before it completely torpedoed your hard-won success. But even after the feast, even after the consummation, your duties often weren't entirely done. The matchmaker's role sometimes extended to post-nuptial supervision. You might be tasked with ensuring that the dowry was actually paid in full, that the agreed-upon lands were transferred, and that the couple was at least cohabiting, even if they clearly loathed the sight of each other. You were a medieval project manager, ensuring all deliverables were met and that the clients were, if not happy, then at least outwardly compliant. Any dispute, any complaint, any sign that the agreement wasn't being honored, and you'd be dragged back into the fray, mediating, negotiating, and often, quite literally, trying to prevent a war. Your success was less a joyous celebration and more a constant, low-level anxiety that would plague you for months, if not years, after the ink was dry and the vows were uttered. And don't forget the occasional need to discreetly inquire if a child was on the way, the ultimate indicator of a truly successful match. You've orchestrated the wedding, survived the consummation, and even navigated the boozy chaos of the feast. You think you can finally breathe, perhaps collect your hard-earned and likely delayed payment. Oh, you sweet summer child. This is the medieval period. There are no happily ever afters, only grimly enduring until death do us part. And often, even death was a slow, agonizing wait. The reality of many medieval marriages was bleak, stripped bare of any romantic illusion. There was no love, merely duty. No emotional connection, just the relentless grind of daily life, the expectation to produce children, and the grim necessity of enduring each other's presence, often for decades, within the cold, drafty walls of a castle or hovel. The best you could hope for was a grudging respect, a quiet toleration, a mutual understanding that you were both trapped in this particular social contract, and you might as well make the best of it. And by best of it, I mean not attempting to poison each other at dinner. And who, pray tell, was the designated recipient of all the inevitable complaints and recriminations? Why, you, of course, the ever-convenient matchmaker. You were the therapist of last resort, the medieval customer service representative for a product that consistently failed to deliver on its advertised promises. Wives would complain of cruelty, neglect, or the husband's unfortunate habit of passing out face first in the stew. Husbands would complain of infertility, shrewishness, or the wife's perplexing inability to produce anything but daughters. Families would complain of squandered assets, unfulfilled promises, and the general moral decay of their new in-laws. You'd be summoned to endless, excruciating meetings, forced to listen to bitter recriminations, mediate petty squabbles, and generally absorb the sheer, unadulterated misery of two people who were locked into a lifetime of forced cohabitation. Your job was less about resolving disputes and more about deflecting blame, reminding everyone of the contract, and generally acting as a punching bag for centuries of marital dissatisfaction. And when things went truly sour, when the marriage was an unmitigated disaster, was there an escape hatch? Not really. Annulment and divorce, in the modern sense, were practically non-existent. Annulments were exceedingly difficult to obtain, usually requiring proof of a pre-existing impediment, such as consanguinity, you married your third cousin once removed, oops, pre-contract, one of you was secretly betrothed to someone else, or impotence, which, as we discussed, was a huge deal-breaker. They were expensive, time-consuming, and required the intervention of the church hierarchy. Divorce, which allowed for remarriage, was virtually impossible. Once you were married, you were stuck, for life, even if your spouse was a raging psychopath who openly declared their intent to cook you in pie. You were bound by sacred vows, by legal contracts, and by the sheer, unyielding weight of medieval social norms. So, if your matchmaking efforts produced an unholy union of misery, too bad. Everyone was just going to have to suck it up, and you, the matchmaker, would be left with a permanent stain on your professional ledger. Which brings us to the dreaded bad matchmaker label. One truly awful marriage, one catastrophic pairing that dissolved into public scandal, or worse, violence, could haunt your reputation for decades. Your name would become synonymous with failure, a whispered warning in noble circles. "Oh, you don't want to hire him," they'd say. "He's the one who married Lord Percival to that woman who kept trying to commune with demons in the kitchen." Your once bustling business would dry up, clients would avoid you like the plague, which, coincidentally, was also often present, and you'd find yourself reduced to arranging marriages for impoverished peasants and their even more impoverished livestock. A matchmaker's reputation was their most precious currency, and once it was tarnished, once that indelible bad match label was affixed to your name, it was almost impossible to scrub clean, leaving you to wander the dusty roads, forever cursed with the memory of your past failures and the bitter complaints of the eternally unhappy. You might think that operating in such a niche, ethically dubious profession would mean you were unique, a singular purveyor of matrimonial misery. You would be wrong. The medieval matchmaking world was surprisingly cutthroat, teeming with rivals, all vying for the same desperate clientele. Other professional matchmakers were out there, lurking in the shadows, ready to snatch away your next big commission. They were trying to out-scheme you, out-gossip you, and generally outperform you in the brutal game of human brokering. They'd spread rumors about your past failures, subtly undermine your negotiations, and offer slightly better, or at least more believable, exaggerations of their prospects' assets. Imagine trying to close a multi-million-dollar deal only to have a rival slip in at the last minute, promising a slightly larger dowry or a slightly less diseased suitor. It was a constant, low-level war of attrition, fought with whispered slanders and carefully crafted lies, where your most potent weapon was often your ability to find out your rival's dirtiest secrets and use them at the most opportune moment. And just when you thought you had a handle on the professional competition, enter the chaotic, unpredictable force of family interference. Overbearing parents, conniving aunts, ambitious siblings, they all thought they could do a better job than you, the seasoned professional. They'd meddle in negotiations, try to introduce their own better candidates, usually their sickly, unpopular cousins, and generally make your life a living hell. They'd question your choices, insult your prospects, and often, without your knowledge, directly approach the other family, offering contradictory terms and unraveling weeks of delicate diplomacy, They were the ultimate micromanagers, convinced their limited experience in arranging two successful marriages within their immediate family made them an expert in the intricate art of inter-kingdom matrimonial alliances. And almost invariably, they made things worse, complicating deals, offending powerful families, and leaving you to clean up the diplomatic mess with a strained smile and a growing urge to just retire to a monastery and embrace celibacy. But the competition wasn't just secular. The clergy, those pious purveyors of spiritual guidance, also frequently dabbled in matchmaking. Priests, abbots, and bishops sometimes acted as matchmakers, especially for their congregations, and particularly for the local gentry. This added another complex layer of competition. How do you, a mere mortal broker of flesh and land, compete with a man of God who claims divine insight into suitable pairings? Their commissions might be more spiritual, prayers, tithes, donations to the church, but their influence was immense. They had access to intimate family confessions, they were often trusted members of the community, and their blessing, or curse, could make or break a match. You had to navigate this delicate dance, respecting their authority while subtly trying to prove your own superior secular skills, all without accidentally incurring the wrath of a particularly zealous bishop who might accuse you of witchcraft if your deal went too spectacularly wrong. In this treacherous landscape, building a brand was everything. Your reputation, your particular niche, was your most valuable and most fragile asset. Were you known for your ruthlessness, your ability to extract every last ounce of advantage from a negotiation? Were you renowned for your discretion, your ability to keep the most scandalous secrets under wraps? Or were you the legendary matchmaker who could find a spouse for anyone, no matter how unsightly, how dim-witted, or how prone to public flatulence? Your brand dictated your clientele, your fees, and your professional longevity. One catastrophic failure, one instance where your carefully cultivated image was shattered, and your career could evaporate like morning mist. You were constantly tending this fragile flame of your reputation, fending off rivals, fending off family interference, and fending off the omnipresent threat of the clergy, all while trying to maintain a facade of serene competence in a world designed to chew you up and spit you out. All right, after all that blood, sweat, and ethically questionable behavior, let's talk about the payoff, the compensation. What you could get paid versus what you actually got paid was often a chasm wider and more treacherous than any medieval moat. In theory, for a truly successful, high-stakes match, you could get paid handsomely. Gold, gleaming piles of it, clinking silver coins, even parcels of land, a small manor, a percentage of a dowry, or a share of future harvests from the newly consolidated estates. These were the grand dreams, the visions that fueled your ceaseless machinations, the glimmering hope that kept you wading through the swamp of human desperation. A successful match could genuinely set you up for life, elevate you beyond your humble origins, and secure your own comfortable, by medieval standards, future. But let's get real. What you actually got paid was often a stark contrast to those glittering fantasies. It was often less than promised, delayed for months or years, while families found new excuses or paid entirely in kind. Imagine sealing a deal for a duke and a duchess only to receive a particularly scrawny, plague-ridden chicken, a sack of suspiciously lumpy grain, 3 worn-out tunics, and a promise of a bed for the night should you find yourself in the area. The constant struggle to collect your fees, to chase down recalcitrant nobles who suddenly developed amnesia about their contractual obligations, was an occupational hazard in itself. You were a medieval collections agent, except instead of calling, you were often risking your life traveling through bandit-infested roads to demand payment from a lord who might decide it was cheaper to simply throw you in his dungeon than to cough up the agreed-upon sum. The feast of your success often ended with you gnawing on a dry crust of bread, wondering if that chicken was even still alive. And then there were the more ethereal, intangible forms of payment, payments in favors, the promise of future assistance, political protection, influence in high places. "I shall speak well of you to the king," a baron might declare, puffing out his chest. "I shall ensure your family receives a favorable judgment in that land dispute," a wealthy merchant would vow. These were the promises, often vague and utterly unreliable, that you were forced to accept when actual coin was scarce. You built up a network of favors, a mental ledger of quid pro quos, hoping that when the time came, these promises would actually materialize into something tangible, something edible. But often, they were merely empty words, forgotten as soon as the ink dried on the marriage contract, leaving you with nothing but a well-worn parchment and the bitter taste of broken promises. It was like getting paid in exposure in the modern gig economy, except the exposure might be to the elements or to a disgruntled lord's private army. And the absolute indignity of the failure fee. If the match fell through, and as we've established, there were a million ways it could, you might get absolutely nothing. All your months of travel, investigation, negotiation, and risk-taking for naught. Worse, you might even have to pay penalties yourself, returning any advance payments, or even being forced to compensate the aggrieved parties for their loss. Imagine investing months of your life, sacrificing your safety, risking your reputation, only to end up not only empty-handed, but actually in debt because two insipid nobles couldn't keep their hands off their respective cousins. It was the ultimate professional insult, a slap in the face with a particularly rancid fish. Your entire livelihood could be wiped out by one collapsed deal, leaving you destitute and desperate, searching for the next desperate family to exploit. And speaking of outflow, let's not forget the constant, insidious cost of doing business. Bribes for servants, for gossip mongers, for local officials to turn a blind eye to your snooping. Informants, their information wasn't free. Travel, endless, dangerous journeys across treacherous roads, paying for lodging, food, and protection. Housing, you couldn't sleep under a different bush every night, could you? These were the constant outflows of resources, the unceasing drain on your meager coffers, all before you ever saw a single, actual coin in return. You were constantly operating at a deficit, gambling your present resources on the vague, often distant promise of future income. It was a high-risk, high-reward profession, but the rewards were often elusive, and the risks were all too real, all too present, and all too likely to leave you with nothing but a lingering smell of horse dung and regret. If you've managed to stay awake through this litany of woe, prepare yourself for the grand finale of suckiness, the occupational hazards. Because being a medieval matchmaker wasn't just emotionally draining and financially precarious, it was downright dangerous. You were operating in a viper's nest of powerful families, and a bad match could easily plunge you into political fallout. Being caught in the crossfire of powerful families was a terrifying reality. If a match you brokered caused a major conflict, a border dispute, a succession crisis, a full-blown war, you were the convenient scapegoat, the patsy upon whom all blame would fall. This wasn't just a stern talking to. It could lead to imprisonment, a delightful stay in a damp, rat-infested dungeon, often without trial. Or exile, forced to wander the land like a common vagabond. Or, in the worst-case scenario, a public execution, a swift, sharp meeting with a headsman, your severed head displayed on a pike as a warning to other meddling busybodies. No pressure, just the risk of a gruesome public death looming over every potential alliance you tried to broker. And then there was the ever-present threat of blame and vengeance. You were the designated punching bag for anything and everything that went wrong. An easy scapegoat. Angry families seeking retribution for a perceived slight, a failed marriage, a barren bride, or an impotent groom would come looking for you. This wasn't just rhetorical fury. It could manifest as actual physical violence. You might find yourself beaten, robbed, or run out of town by a furious mob, perhaps even permanently maimed if you were particularly unlucky. Your reputation was everything, but it was also a giant, flashing target. You could be accused of deception, of fraud, of poisoning minds, or of any number of other medieval transgressions. It wasn't a desk job, not by a long shot. Every meeting, every negotiation, every trip was fraught with the potential for physical harm, a stark reminder that your profession literally put your body on the line. But perhaps the most insidious, terrifying threat of all was the accusation of witchcraft. If things went particularly wrong, if a match was deemed too unnatural, perhaps a perfectly healthy young woman suddenly withered away after marrying your client, or if a series of misfortunes befell a noble house after one of your pairings, accusations of dark magic were a very real, very terrifying threat. In an era rife with superstition and fear, being branded a witch or a sorcerer was a death sentence. You would face interrogation, torture, and eventually the pyre. Imagine trying to explain to a superstitious mob or a zealous inquisitor that Lord Cedric's sudden impotence was due to a genetic predisposition, not your carefully brewed love potion gone wrong. It was a constant, chilling reminder that your craft, your ability to manipulate human lives, could easily be twisted into evidence of pacts with dark forces, turning your professional misfortune into a literal blaze of glory. Physical threats weren't just theoretical. The roads were dangerous, infested with bandits, rival nobles, and common thugs. Being robbed of your meager earnings was a common occurrence. Being beaten, left for dead, or having your valuable documents stolen were all possibilities on every journey. If you managed to survive the elements, disease, and starvation, there was always the very human threat of violence. And let's not forget the sheer discomfort of medieval travel. Rough roads, unsanitary inns, the constant exposure to the elements. You were a road warrior, albeit one whose weapons were wit and a good parchment, and whose armor was often just a threadbare cloak. Your body was constantly at risk, a vessel for your ambition, battered by the realities of a brutal age. And underpinning all of these more immediate dangers was the lingering specter of reputational ruin. A single disastrous match, One truly spectacular failure that captured the gossip mills could destroy your career, leaving you destitute and despised. All the goodwill, all the carefully cultivated connections, all the painstaking effort to build your brand could vanish overnight. You would be a pariah, unable to find new clients, unable to earn a living, forced to scrounge for survival, forever marked by your past failures. Your name would be mud, whispered in hushed tones as a cautionary tale. It was the ultimate professional death sentence, a slow, agonizing descent into irrelevance and poverty, a fate almost worse than the headsman's axe, because you'd still be alive to experience every miserable, agonizing moment of it. So, there you have it. The full, unvarnished, deliciously dark truth of why it sucked, with an intensity usually reserved for medieval dentistry or a bad case of the plague, to be a medieval matchmaker. We've journeyed through the political quagmires, the financial minefields, the human horror shows, and the very real physical dangers that characterized this utterly thankless profession. From navigating the treacherous waters of familial feuds, to convincing desperate nobles that their sickly, odd-smelling offspring was a catch, from haggling over dowries to risking your neck over a broken betrothal, every single aspect of the job was a testament to the sheer, unyielding misery of medieval existence. The pressure, the danger, the constant threat of public humiliation, or worse, and the undeniable fact that your success often hinged on two people being profoundly unhappy. It was a nightmare job, plain and simple. And yet, in a darkly comedic twist, we must offer a sarcastic nod to these unsung heroes. These individuals, these brokers of human misery, these architects of arranged unhappiness, facilitated a fundamental, if brutally pragmatic, aspect of medieval society. They kept the social order from dissolving into chaos, ensured the transfer of wealth and power, and, most crucially, kept the lines of succession flowing. Without them, the medieval world would have been even more unstable, even more prone to internecine warfare and economic collapse. They were the grimy, unacknowledged gears in the vast, creaking machine of feudalism, making sure the wheels kept turning, no matter how much human suffering they left in their wake. So, raise a tankard of stale ale to the medieval matchmaker, the original master of toxic productivity, without whom none of that boring history would have happened. Now, let's bring it back to the present, shall we? You think your modern dating woes are bad? That swiping right on someone who turns out to be a crypto bro living in their mom's basement is a traumatic experience? At least your bad date probably won't start a civil war. Your awkward first encounter won't result in your family losing their ancestral lands, or you being accused of witchcraft. Your dating app profile isn't scrutinized for signs of hidden leprosy or a suspicious family penchant for incest. You can, for the most part, date for love, or at least for a shared interest in artisanal coffee and true crime podcasts. You can ghost someone without fear of an angry mob descending upon your village, demanding compensation for emotional damages. So, next time you're lamenting the indignities of modern romance, just remember, it could always be worse. You could be convincing a leper to marry a mute for a chicken. And with that delightful thought, we draw to a close. If you've managed to stay awake through this harrowing, delightfully depressing journey into the past, congratulations! Your insomnia is truly formidable. Or perhaps you found the sheer, unadulterated grimness of it all oddly soothing. If so, consider subscribing. Or don't. History doesn't care. It simply exists, in all its brutal, smelly, and occasionally darkly humorous glory. But if you did find a perverse sense of satisfaction in this deep dive into medieval suckiness, perhaps give us a like or share this with a friend you secretly suspect needs a dose of historical perspective. And now, as the last embers of our historical misery fade into the twilight, I wish you a peaceful, matchmaker-free sleep. May your dreams be filled with modern amenities, clean air, and absolutely no arranged marriages. Good night. If you're still awake, you might want to consider your life choices.